All right, how you guys doing? Hopefully you're doing well. Hopefully you're surviving COVID. Today is Thursday, October 14th, 15th. I think it's the 15th. Anyways, this video is being recorded on Thursday, but it's meant to be viewed on Monday. Whether you get around to viewing it at that time, I don't know. I don't really care. But what matters is that you eventually do view this. And that's the point that I would make in conjunction with all the previous videos. Some of you have not been viewing these videos, and I know this because they have fewer views than there are people in this class, which tells me that and it could very well be the case that one of you is just viewing these videos over and over and over again. Maybe that's the case. I don't know. But they only have 8 views, which is bad. Maybe I'm doing a very horrible job. Maybe you guys are just getting lackadaisical and indifferent towards this class because you think, he's only on YouTube. He's not actually there to make sure I'm doing anything. Well, that's true. That's true. And the point I would make about that is to say that, while I think there are certain very conspicuous advantages to having this class conducted in the manner that it's being conducted right now, which is to say online, and I went through and I enumerated those various conspicuous advantages last week. The fact that the test will be much, much, much easier, immeasurably easier, is certainly one of them. The fact that you guys don't have to get up at 6 or 7 or 8 a.m. in the morning, I think that's a relief. I think that has a salutary effect, at least physiologically for you. The fact that you don't have to necessarily subject yourself to the possibility of getting infected with COVID because of the things that you do incidental to or ancillary to, associated with going to class, filling your car up, stopping at Tim Hortons, getting a donut, getting coffee, etc. All those things are advantageous for you as well as for me. The other side of the equation, however, and I get that there is another side. It's not all good, right? Some of you may say, and you haven't said it to me, but I assume that maybe this is on your minds, that the problem though is that there's not a lot of direct interface, no direct interpersonal interface between us and you, Jeff. And yeah, that's true. Okay, by definition, that's the way this works. And I'm sorry, guys, I gotta adjust this camera, and I apologize for this. I gotta get up close and personal so you can admire my new Tommy Hilfiger cut here. Long story short, my girlfriend was over here the other day, and she said, Jeff, you look kind of like a douchebag. She didn't actually say that in so many words, but she rather none too subtly hinted at that. And she was appalled to know that I was wearing Walmart's finest when I was giving these lectures in this format. And she thought, well, she's a fashionista. She knows how to dress herself. She has a very refined sense of style. And she said, you got to look more appropriate. You got to look more the part. You got to play the part that you're playing. You got to look the role, look the part of the role that you're playing. And I said, well, what is a professor of, what is an instructor of various subjects at Gilbert Community College supposed to look like? Well, apparently he's supposed to look like this. He's supposed to wear a Tommy Hilfiger coat and a matching hat. The price tag on this coat was originally $179, but I think she got it at discountproducts.com or something. But anyways. Hopefully I'm looking more fashionable, because I know you guys are really concerned about that. I actually thought about wearing my Soviet officer's reenactment uniform here. Some of you are aware of the fact that I'm a historical reenactor. I don't think I divulged that to all of you, but I've got pictures of me wearing a Soviet NKVD lieutenant's uniform. It's actually the full thing. I got the boots, I got the belt, I got the holster, I even got the gun, and the hat and the jacket and everything else. I thought about doing that, but then I thought, well, maybe some of you might be intimidated by that, and you might think that that's scary or frightening. But it's coming close to Halloween, so maybe I'll dress up like that next time, or maybe I'll just dress up like the clown from the movie It. I told some students a couple of years ago that I was going to do that and run around in the woods outside of campus there behind the Copper Country Center, dressed up as the clown from It, and then scare people as they come out of their cars. And they said that that's a bad idea, Jeff, because the locals here, they'd shoot you if you did that. I said, yeah, you're probably right. All right, so back to reasons why. Well, reasons why we're doing this. You guys know the reasons why we're doing this, because it would be unconscionable for me not to do this. It would be unconscionable for me to do the things that are consequential to my relocating to back where I came from, the house in Calumet, where my parents are currently domiciled, and will be there until 10 days from now. Which is to say that enjoy the online lectures while they last, because they're not going to last for much longer. And I guess I don't know whether or not, sure, I'll go ahead and put it out there. I mean, I don't think it really matters at this point, because I think I get the sense that more of you are more inclined towards the online modality of instruction than is to say that that there are fewer, rather there are less of you that think that I'm doing you some kind of disservice by not actually being there physically in person. I don't think there's a lot of you who think that. Maybe you do, and you just don't feel as though you can articulate that because you're concerned that it might hurt my feelings. I don't know, but well, I was going to say let's take a vote and determine whether or not we just keep on doing YouTube lectures. But I guess I can't do that because you guys pay for a physical class, and I don't think it's my prerogative to override or supersede that because indeed some of you may feel as though this is a deprivation of sorts. I personally don't think it is a deprivation. In fact, I think you're actually getting more analytical, constructive, substantive lecture content via these videos than you would be if I was actually there physically in person because I tend to get more distracted in that classroom because it's got the skeleton, it's got the white dry erase board, it's got the Legos and things to play with. There's stuff in this room that I could be distracted with too, but I don't allow myself these distractions. So I think you're actually getting more substantive course delivery in the context of these videos. So this is one of those things where I don't really know whether or not I'm going to do this, but what I might decide to do is I might try to make this video slightly more than 2 hours long. And what this would therefore be is a video not just for Monday, but also a video for Wednesday's class. I don't know. It depends on how I feel. It depends on how efficiently and lucidly I get through this material. But this may be one of those instances. Actually, it'd be the first instance because I don't think I've done this yet, where I just say, you know, this is the video for the entire week. All right. And if I don't do that, though, all right, if I feel as though this is just droning on and it's getting very lugubrious and I may be disenfranchising you guys as the viewers, I may cut this off in an hour and 30 minutes because 90 minutes is a long enough time to listen to anybody, particularly me. If you think it's bad to have to listen to me, imagine how much more difficult it is for me to stand here for an hour and a half and talk in these ridiculous clothes. Don't tell my girlfriend I said that. Okay. So I don't think there's any other matters of administrative consideration that need to be dispensed with before we actually get into the substance of today's lecture. But if I can think of any, I'll come back to this point in time and I'll address those as they come up in my mind. All right, so we're talking about the end of Cambyses, right? We're talking about this guy Cambyses, and we said that the problem with our understanding of how Cambyses ended is that we can't really trust the sources because, as per usual, when we're talking about ancient Persia in general, or in particular, I should say, is that the sources don't have much historical veracity. They lack historical factual authenticity to them because they come from people who have a subjective mindset with respect to how they're distorting and contriving these facts in a way that fits their particular narrative objectives, their political partisan objectives. Well, their ethnic, partisan, political, ideological, whatever you want to refer to them, their subjective interests. And that's the problem with a lot of this is that it's framed in the context of some kind of subjective perception, either through the filter of Herodotus, who we know is a Greek who absolutely has disdain and contempt for Persians, or it's coming from the Egyptians, who would have a great deal of animosity towards Cambyses because he's the one, after all, who killed their sacred cow. So there's a great deal of confusion that abounds with respect to these sources, and it's very difficult to differentiate between that which is actually solid and reliable and factually has a good deal of factual integrity, or that which is lacking in factual veracity. So therefore, we can't necessarily say that any of these stories are particularly true. What we have to do is look at the consensus and see whether or not there are similarities between these stories. But then that in of itself is problematic because if you're somebody who's going to disparage, if you're a historical primary source creator and you're writing about Cambyses, even if you're an Egyptian or even if you're a Greek or even if you're a Persian, regardless of who you happen to be, you're probably going to be focused on the same sort of criticisms because those are the things that are most conspicuously bad about the person you're writing about. So I think it's even when we say we got to find a consensus because that's typically what historians do with respect to these issues. They try to resolve these issues by looking at, well, what does the majority say? Okay, what are most of the sources saying, or do they reach an agreement on anything? But that's a moot point if the thing that they're going to agree upon is the thing that they all find to be most egregiously offensive, and they're all therefore inclined to embellish that thing. All right, so it's a catch-22. All right, but I'm not here to sit around and talk about the authenticity of sources to you all day. What I need to talk about is the successor of Cambyses, and his name was Darius. Okay, we talked a little bit about this guy. Now, Darius, unlike Cambyses, who came before him, did not uh, was not actually a member of the royal family. Okay, was not a member was not a direct descendant of Cyrus, and there's a lot to be said for somebody who devolves from is can trace their direct familial lineage back to not just the king who came before this guy, right, but the originator, the founder, the incipient creator of not just the dynasty but also ancient Persia as a geopolitical entity. To be able to say, if you're Cambyses, okay, you're a bit of a douchebag. You know, you went down there in Egypt, you killed this sacred cow, you went out there and you lost 50,000 guys, you offended against the gods, you brought down the wrath of the gods, you ruled like a disreputable and despicable tyrant, you were a bit megalomaniacal, right? Again, you were a total doucher. But alas, okay, despite all those very disreputable qualities that are associated with you, incontrovertibly so, right? At the end of the day, at least you can fall back on the claim that but my ancestry. Look at this. I can trace it back to this guy Cyrus, and he was the George Washington of ancient Persia. And that in some way, that sort of it sanitizes, it cleanses, or it ameliorates many of the negative connotations that are associated with me as Cambyses, as the douchebag megalomaniacal ruler. You could say, well, yeah, but you know what? His father is Cyrus. Okay, so we defer to the guy. We give him some deference. We give him some fair consideration. We allow him greater discretion, and we allow him greater latitude precisely because of who his father was. Now, that's the way it worked in the ancient world, because they believed that if you were of noble stock, noble ancestry, that conferred upon you certain not just privileges and rights, but it conferred upon you something more esoteric, something more abstract, something intangible, right? It's difficult to really articulate this in terms that are intelligible to you as an audience, but I can just say this. I mean, there's a quote from, I think it may have been Horace, okay, who was an ancient poet, and he said something about how men will not follow other men if they believe that that other man does not have noble blood. Okay, and it's a quick and dirty bastardization of what he actually says, because what he says is actually much more eloquent than that. But the point that he's making is that men so you're talking about soldiers in battle, right? Soldiers in battle will be much more likely to be inspired by a leader if in fact they know that that leader has noble blood or has noble lineage. Now, why is that important? Well, this goes back to what I said about the connection, the inexorable, indissoluble connection between the gods and kings, okay? And that men at that time, in the ancient time, whether it's ancient Persia, whether it's ancient Babylon, whether it's ancient Greece or Rome or Egypt, it doesn't matter. In the ancient time, the time of pre-modern history, men, because they were superstitious and ignorant, because they didn't know enough, they presupposed that the gods divinely anointed the king. And if you are a king that is divinely anointed, what is it? It says something about you, right? It says you were obviously favored by the gods, and therefore you were meant to rule, and therefore this is something that is preordained. You can't overthrow or repudiate this because it was mandated by the gods, right? But it also says something about your progeny, your sons, okay? Because this is primogeniture, we defer to the son, the eldest son, not the eldest daughter. We skip over her. She just gets to be the handmaiden, okay? She gets to be the Handmaid's Tale from Netflix, right? That's what she gets to do, okay? What do we therefore impute if we believe in this supernatural divine power or mandate or authority of kings, which derives or descends from on high from the gods? What does that suggest about the son of the king? What does that suggest about his son and his successor and his inheritor of his legacy? Well, it suggests that he too therefore was divinely anointed or appointed or legitimated. His rule was authenticated by virtue of the fact that the gods approved his father. And if the gods approved his father, then the gods must have known the father was going to have a son, because the gods know everything, right? And therefore they must, by implication, therefore, I mean, it proceeds logically from that argument that the gods must also have authorized or assented to, right, or at least not been opposed to or offended by the notion that this guy's son is now going to take over the throne, is going to succeed the father, inherit the power of the father. So I think that says a lot about this. This goes to the reason and the rhyme and the rationale as to why people deferred to authority that was inherited. Why there was this precedent for, again, and this transcends the time, the chronology, and the space and the time of ancient Persia. This is a topic that is culturally, anthropologically, ethnically, geopolitically transcendent. It applies to many different contexts, many different places, in many different ways. It's the idea that, the question you have to ask yourself is, why is it that these ancient peoples necessarily implicitly deferred to the sovereign right of a king's son to necessarily rule without having actually established himself as a ruler first and proven himself that he actually has the aptitude and the capacity to rule? Why do they just assume, why do they just presuppose out of course, as a matter of course, that by virtue of the fact that you are this guy's son, in this case Cyrus's son, Cambyses, that therefore that gives you the right to rule ipso facto, de facto? Okay, why does that therefore, right, a priori, right? Why do we assume that you have the right to rule merely because of who your father was and not because you proved or substantiated yourself as a ruler? Well, again, this goes to the supernatural connection between the right to rule and the connection that the ruler has with divine authorities, those who allow, those who not just allow, but mandate and command that Cyrus be the ruler. And this is why, going back to the idea that all founding, all great empires, all great nations and states and kingdoms, they all have a founding myth, all right? An origin story, right? There's Wolverine origins, Hugh Jackman, how he got his adamantium claws. He was imprisoned by Colonel Stryker up there in the Canadian Rockies, up there in British Columbia, or wherever it was, where they had the secret base. And then they injected him with adamantium, this liquid hot metal, and then he had these claws, and then he got all pissed off because he was roid raging because Hugh Jackman was probably doing a lot of roids to get buff for that role, and then he just cut some guys up, and right. Well, that's the story, okay? That's the origin story. Well, why does Cyrus have an origin story, okay? Why was this whole convoluted story about Astyages and this rather ridiculous dream that he had about, this perverse dream that he had about his daughter, you know, this Trumpian wet dream that he had about his daughter? Why was there all that, okay? That seems to be rather nonsensical. That seems to be rather farcical and fantastical. Well, that's the whole point, because these people, these ignorant pre-modern people, were stultified by these phantasmagorical stories of fantastical legendary origins, and they believed this stuff, and they subscribed to it, and they adhered to it, and they assimilated to it, and therefore, the more ignorant your people are, the more likely they're going to be prone to believe in these supernatural, ridiculous stories. And so that's why, well, that's one of the that's the reason why the rulers are able to propagate and disseminate these stories with some degree of conviction, and the people actually believe in their legitimacy and their veracity because they don't know any better but to believe in them, even though, you know, they're just too ignorant to know the difference. But the reason as to why they do this, okay, that's I guess that's the reason as to why these stories actually have, you know, they resonate with the people, and they're not ipso facto just challenged as being superstitious nonsense because the people are too stupid to know otherwise. But the incipient reason that inspires these stories in the first place is because the rulers of these ancient states are lucid and intelligent enough to understand that the best way to authenticate and indeed insulate my power, provide some kind of insurance against the possibility of rebellion or revolt, or, you know, claims being made by illegitimate claimants to the throne, the best way to insulate myself from those potential attacks on my credibility is to say, not that I rule because by virtue of the fact that, you know, by virtue of who my father was, and just period, right? There's a finality to that, right? No, that's not what they say. They say, I rule. I acquired the right to rule. In the case of Cyrus, he acquired the right to rule because he was vindicating. He was vindicating the crime that was attempted by his grandfather, and that the gods had preordained this, and they had destined that he be protected, that he be sought, that his protectors seek out this shepherd family and this rural redneck and his daughter, or his wife, to raise Cyrus. And it has all these legendary elements to the story, so as to make it seem supernatural, so as to make it seem as though it has this metaphysical connotation to it, whereby the gods must have been interceding on behalf of Cyrus. And so too is the case with all of these origin stories, with these origin stories with respect to dynasties anyways. Now, Darius has a problem, okay? This goes back to the point that I have to make about Darius. All right, so all this is actually just sort of a precursor, it's a prerequisite to understanding the problem that Darius has. The problem that Darius has, to put it succinctly, is that he's not a part of the dynasty. Okay, he's an outside contract. He's out of house, right? He's not in the house. Okay, he's not in the dynastic house that Cyrus established for himself, because Darius he's not just some guy. Okay, I mean, he's I guess I should say who who Darius is. Darius is a member of the aristocracy of ancient Persia. He's an aristocrat, and furthermore, he's an aristocrat who fought bravely and honorably, provided military service on behalf of the Persian kings before him, so Cambyses and Cyrus, Yeah, that's what Darius was a soldier, was a warrior, was an officer, and he moved. He came up through the ranks, so to speak. He didn't start off as a buck private or a buck recruit. He started off as, I don't know, probably a major or lieutenant colonel. The point is, he started off pretty high up in the ranks because he was an aristocrat, and that's the way it worked. And he worked his way up to even higher ranks until he reached the rank of what was known as lance bearer. Okay, this is a high distinguished rank of privilege and prestige in the ranks, the various ranks that you could occupy within the army of ancient Persia. You may say that sounds kind of like a bitch position, right? Lance bearer, what's that? You go walk around and carry this guy's lance. It sounds like you're getting punked. Okay, well you may rightly believe that, and it sounds kind of like that. I agree that on the face of it does sound like that, right? But it's not. Okay, it's like briefcase carrier for the president. Okay, nuclear code briefcase carrier. Right, the guy who actually carries the briefcase for the president is an 06. He's a full bird colonel, which is one rank under the. Actually, no, I'm sorry, he's an 07. He's a brigadier general. They got this guy, right, wherever the president of the United States goes around, right, whether he's in Air Force One, whether he's in some convoy with a bunch of Escalades, wherever he's at, whether he's in Walter Reed recuperating from COVID, wherever he's at, there's a guy that's nearby in the room next door to him, or in the same room as him, or wherever he's at, where he's never more than 100 feet away from the president, okay, at any given time, right? Even when the president's sleeping in the Lincoln bedroom with Melania there, right? She probably doesn't sleep with him. I don't think they've been sleeping together for years. We don't hear about this, but it's kind of inferred by the way they can carry themselves in public. But when Trump's sleeping by himself in the Lincoln bedroom, or with whoever, Ivanka, the guy is never more than 100 feet away from the president, right? Whether it's Trump, whether it's anyway. This guy's got a briefcase, and in the briefcase is a bunch of codes, the nuclear codes, and enables the president to engage with the nuclear system and initiate the launch sequence, or elevate us to DEFCON 5 or DEFCON 4, whatever it happens to be, and then initiate our nuclear response, which is the nuclear triad, the bombers, the nuclear subs, and the ICBMs launched in North Dakota or wherever they're from. Now that guy holds the rank of brigadier general because he's very important. Okay. Now I think the relationship of that guy, the briefcase carrier who goes on Air Force One and follows the president around with his briefcase nuclear codes, that's analogous to the relationship that the lance bearer had vis-a-vis the king of ancient Persia, right? So you'd say, well, it's just a lance. Come on, it's a stick with a spear on the end of it. This guy just carries it around all the time. Right? So what? Well, maybe future generations will say that about the brigadier general who carries the president's briefcase around. He's a glorified valet, for Christ's sakes. All right, he's a guy who carries my briefcase around for me. That sounds like Jeeves, right? Where's Jeeves? He's the butler. You guys remember the British butler, Jeeves? Ask Jeeves. I think there's a website called Ask Jeeves, because apparently if you're a British butler for some aristocratic douchebag in England, you're smart and you know the answer to things. So that's the relationship that the lance bearer had to the king of kings, the king of the four corners of the world, etc., etc. And so Darius came up through the ranks and he acquired that position. So he was a man of note. He distinguished himself militarily, which is really, if you don't have credibility by virtue of who your father was or who his father was before him, and so on and so forth, if you don't have that credibility, the name recognition factor, the Hillary Clinton factor, if you don't have that going for you in the ancient world, then the thing that you better have going for you is some military martial prowess. You better have on your record incontrovertible evidence that you've gone out there in battle, you've earned the stripes, right? You've earned some stripes, you got some rockers, you got some sergeant stripes up here. In this case, you got your brigadier general, lance bearer, whatever it is. But you've gone out there, you killed people, you've led men in battle, you've shown that you are courageous, you've shown that you are brave, you've shown that you have the sorts of martial qualities that are prerequisites to being a good, strong, noble leader, because these are the qualities that are associated with being a virtuous leader as well. Being not just charismatic, right, but being strong, being courageous, being firm, having fortitude, having self-discipline, being a man of conviction, etc. And these are the things that I think you would demonstrate conclusively, if anecdotally, if you in fact had been like Darius and you had come up through the ranks and you had served in a military capacity. So I think this goes back to establishing one's credibility and establishing one's legitimacy. And if you can't say that I trace my lineage on through the kings before me who were my fathers, and their blood courses through my veins, and those fathers who came before me or their grandfather, whoever it happens to be, right, all the way back, you trace that to the incipient point. Well, at some point in time, assuming this is the rightful heir continuing on with the dynastic tradition, well, that guy would say the reason I inherit the right to claim this throne is by virtue of the fact that my grandfather, whoever it happens to be in relation to you, right, the first king was anointed by the gods, and that authority devolves through the generations until it reaches me. Darius couldn't do that. Okay, that's the point. It's a rather convoluted way of getting, circuitous way of reaching this point, but better that we reach the point through the back door, right? But at least get there and make it in a way that's intelligible, so as opposed to just skip through it and get it through the shortcut, right? That's the point, right? So Darius can't say what Cambyses said before him. He can't say, well, you know what, I'm kind of a douchebag. You know, I don't really have many credentials to actually take over the state. I'm a megalomaniacal, you know, guy who doesn't really have a sense of what the proper geopolitical framing is here. But respect me because who my father was. Darius can't do that, right? So Darius has got to show, by virtue of his own merits, okay, he's got to be able to prove conclusively and establish definitively that he's got the right to rule on account of and out of consideration for what he has already done up until that point in time. And that's why it's important for him to assert, you know, make this point about, yeah, I'm the lance bearer, you know, I come up through the ranks. Now, there's something else going on here with Darius, all right? So Darius and this is I hate to have to keep qualifying and prefacing everything that I say by, you know, according to Herodotus, but I'm going to have to put it in those terms because it is according to Herodotus. Darius got together with 7 very prominent, very important, very significant, very prominent nobles of ancient Persia, some very high-ranking nobles, and they had, these nobles in association with Cyrus had been responsible for essentially assassinating the usurper to the throne. Because remember, Cambyses dies, but then there's a fake Cambyses' fake brother, right? There's not the real Cambyses' brother because Cambyses had his brother murdered. It's called fratricide. You've murdered your own brother. It's a very bad thing, then as now. And nobody knew this, right? So there's the fake brother of Cambyses running around pretending that he's the actual legitimate heir to the throne and pretending that he's the rightful claimant to the throne of Persia. And so the 7 nobles in conjunction with Darius, so there's 8 of them. There's 7 plus 1, right? There's 7 nobles plus Darius. These guys are responsible for murdering one of the usurpers. It's not said explicitly who it was. It could have been the fake brother of Cambyses. It could have been one of these priests, one of the magi in Babylon who was pretending to be the rightful ruler. Because remember, there's all these different stories, very divergent, very disparate stories in terms of what actually happens after Cambyses dies, okay? Or whether it happens after Cambyses dies, probably not. More likely it happens nearly contemporaneous with his death, right? Because something happens, right? There's a rebellion in Babylon, most likely. A fake pretender to the throne takes over. It's a guy who's pretending to be Cambyses' brother. It's a priest who's pretending, well, he's not pretending to be anything. He's pretending he's just being a priest. Right? But one of these guys decides, I'm going to take over. I'm going to become the next overlord of Persia because our king is a douchebag. He's down there in Egypt and he just lost 50,000 guys in the desert and he's not actually here and people hate him because of his megalomaniacal ways and because he's offended against the gods, and et cetera, et cetera. Go back to the previous lecture if you don't remember any of this. And so there's all these various claimants and counterclaimants to who the legitimate ruler of Persia is. Well, Darius may not be the legitimate ruler, okay, or have a legitimate claim to rule, rather, but he has I would say he has as good a claim as anybody under the circumstances, and he certainly has a better claim than a lot of them do. And that may be good enough, right? To say that the opposition that's being hailed as the rightful rulers of Persia at this time are just a bunch of guys from Babylon. They happen to be at the right place at the right time, and one of them happened to have the good fortune of looking like the brother of the real brother of Cambyses, when in actuality he's just a fake brother of Cambyses. Well, that doesn't give you any right to rule because you look like some guy, right? And even if you did, so assume you did look like that guy, or you had plastic surgery and you made yourself look, you know, like Saddam Hussein. You had these fake Saddam Husseins running around in Iraq. It was actually a great movie about that. It's called The Devil's Double. It's very interesting. You learn a lot about Uday Saddam Hussein, which is his diabolical son. Believe it when I tell you that there's actually worse people out there than Saddam Hussein himself. His sons were far worse. Well, his son Uday, anyways, like to drive around in a Porsche in downtown Baghdad and abduct young women and then rape them to death and then throw their bodies in the local the marshes, right? Have his bodyguards throw their bodies in the local marshes. Depraved, despotic, degenerate guy. But you could be like Saddam Hussein and have a facelift, right? And look like the brother of Cambyses. Have plastic surgery. Have yourself modified aesthetically. But it doesn't matter, right? That doesn't give you the right to claim to be. Well, first of all, that there's 2 things, right? You don't have the right to claim to be that brother because you're not. But even assuming you were that brother, what gives you the right to be the claimant, the proper claimant to the throne? Well, I mean, if you say that Cambyses no longer had the right to rule, okay, and here's the problem that I have with the fake Cambyses brother guy, okay, right? Because the fake Cambyses brother theory presupposes that guy has got some kind of legitimacy conferred upon him by virtue of the fact that he's related to Cambyses and Cyrus before him, right? But so too is Cambyses. Cambyses was the son of Cyrus, was he not? You know, no more different than the brother of Cambyses, right? And even though he was the son, even though he had the rightful divinely perpetuated right to inherit that descended upon, that devolved upon him from his predecessor, right? Even though he had that right, the people no longer respected the king because of his evil, maniacal, twisted, divergent, convoluted machinations in Egypt, and because of the fact that he offended against the gods by killing the sacred cow, right? So the point here is that there's 2 points. Number one, if even if you do have a divine right to rule in ancient Persia, in ancient Egypt, in ancient China, in ancient Babylon, doesn't matter. If you have a divine right to rule, if you do enough that is in contravention of that divine right to rule, right? That shows that you are actually unworthy of the right that was originally incipiently conferred upon you, that we just presuppose that you have the right to rule by virtue of who your father was and who his father was before him, etc. Right? You can act in a way that is contrary to that assumption. And you can essentially divest yourself of that right to rule by acting in a manner that is contrary to the interests of the people, or contrary to the expectations that they may reasonably have of you, or in contravention of your obligation, your basic primal obligation that you have to your state and your people and the priorities of the nation. Right? So if you act in a way that is completely inconsonant with, or incongruous to, or asymmetrical with, or just antithetical to the expectation that is created of you and for you by the people, well, then you can be dispossessed of the right to rule. It's as simple as that. And so this goes back to what we were talking about way back with ancient China and the whole notion of a mandate of heaven. They don't call it a mandate of heaven in the context of ancient Persia. They don't call it anything, right? It's just the idea that if you are so despotic and you are so maniacal and twisted and degenerate in your fashion and your style and your form of ruling, then the people will eventually grow wary of you. And despite the fact that you've got this noble lineage, despite the fact that your fathers before you were anointed by the gods, and that ostensibly you inherit that prerogative, that divinely mandated prerogative, you will be dispossessed of your right to rule. Now, the second point is that if in fact Cambyses, so there's the fake Cambyses brother running around. Well, if you say that Cambyses, by virtue of his ineptitude and his effectual rule, and the fact that he wasn't guided by justice and prudence and wisdom and fortitude and all the sorts of things that we associate with a virtuous ruler, if he didn't do any of that, right? What are the chances that his equal, his brother is going to do any of that, right? All right. So we got to stop assuming that just because you came from this high pedigree, this really great pedigree, your lineage traces back to Cyrus, that therefore that's enough, right? That's the end of the analysis right there. I don't think we can assume that anymore, and that's kind of the conclusion the people of Persia reached. So that's, in many ways, that's advantageous for Darius, because Darius is saying, look where hereditary monarchy got you. Okay, it got you Cambyses, right? And I'm a man who's going to bring you. I'm going to bring you a lot of new enterprising methods that you haven't seen before. I'm going to be strong, I'm going to be dedicated, I'm going to be resourceful, and above all, I'm going to be just and equitable with respect to my treatment of the people. So, according to Herodotus, okay, here's the according to bit, right? So, again, take this for what it's worth, which is to say it's not worth very much at all. According to Herodotus, says Darius meets with these 7 high-ranking nobles. They get together, they have a little confab, and they begin to discuss what form the government of Persia should take subsequent to the demise of Cambyses and the fake Cambyses people that are out there, right? Because this is an opportunity to start anew, start afresh with a blank slate, tabula rasa, as the Romans would refer to it as, the blank slate, right? So these 7 ostensibly wise, noble men, these noble men who have some civic virtue and commitment to ensuring that they promulgate a form of rule that is most consistent with the best and highest interests of the people. At least again, according to Herodotus, I don't know whether or not they actually did this, but it's interesting to believe. It's funny that it's an interesting philosophical hypothetical to subscribe to this, and you're going to see why in a minute here. So that they get together, right? These seven nobles plus Darius, and they have allegedly they have this long philosophical discourse whereby they go through the various forms which government could conceivably take, because they introspectively reflect upon the fact that the government of absolute monarchy, an autocratic dictatorship, essentially, we're all being ruled by the king, and we're all slaves to the king. And even though he's a great king like Cyrus, assuming that assumes that your king is a benevolent spirit, right? What happens if you've got a malignant and malevolent and insidious spirit like Cambyses? Well, then you're up shit's creek, right, without a paddle. And so the point that these nobles are essentially making, or the point that Herodotus is making by ventriloquizing this philosophical discourse through putting this in the mouths of these nobles, is that there's good reason to disbelieve in the legitimacy and the effectualness of absolute monarchy at this point, because it's essentially proven itself to be unworthy of the people by virtue of the fact that Cambyses was this despotic, maniacal, megalomaniacal guy who was a very bad ruler. And so they have this philosophical discourse, and one of the nobles comes up and he says, I would like to propose a more democratic form of rule for the Persians. And the fellow, the seven other nobles, and Darius, there they turn to him and they say, well, why, brother, uh, whatever your name is, brother Xerxes, why do you propose that? And he says, well, because there's wisdom in crowds, and you get enough people together, they have a certain knowledge in terms of their intuition directs them in a way which is consistent with the best interests of the majority of the people. Because after all, if you empower the people to have some discretionary authority over their own sovereign affairs, well then it stands to reason that they will make decisions that are just. They will make decisions that are adjudicated based on the relevant considerations that are weighed by reason and justice and wisdom, and they won't just act impetuously, or they won't just act in a manner that's depraved or indifferent or callous with respect to the interests of the people. Because after all, they're enacting, they're coming together and they're deciding things by the people and for the people with the consent of the people, right? And these are all the arguments that people would historically have made on behalf of democracy. Um, and Darius comes along and he says, well, that's interesting. Yeah, I understand. Power of the people. That's all good. But Darius says, there's a problem. Okay, because when you give the common people, when you empower them over the affair, we give them discretionary control of the affairs of the state. There's a couple of problems with that. My fellow aristocrat sitting here in this dialectical philosophical exchange. He says the first problem is that you are imputing a great deal of wisdom and intellectual aptitude to people who are completely dispossessed of those qualities. The common people aren't smart enough to know how to even spend their own money. That's why most of the people we don't have more than, I think the average American has, I don't know, something like $2,000 in the bank, right? That's their savings, right? And it was no less true in ancient Persia. You have less than 2,000 shekels in the bank, okay? Right? He said, think about look at how people walk, right? Look at how they drive, for God's sakes. Look at how they drive their horse and buggies around here, right? Right, or their ox cart, or whatever they're driving around. Look at how stupid they drive, right? You honestly think that we can empower the people to make their own discretionary judgments on behalf of the interests of the state as well as themselves? They can't even make their own decisions that are in their own best interest, because they're too stupid, they're too naive, they're too crude, they're too ignorant. They don't know enough. They don't know enough to know just how much they don't know, right? That's not too much of a sophistic statement for you, right? And Darius makes all these various points. And basically, the thrust of his argument is that we can't trust the people because they don't know enough to make competent decisions, right? They don't have the requisite intellectual qualities. They're not sufficiently wise. They're not sufficiently just. They don't have the sorts of virtues that men of greater quality and character and caliber do have. And so then one of the other nobles comes along. He says, "Well, okay, that's all well and good, Darius, but you make this point about men of good character and men of good breeding, men of good pedigree, right? What about us? Why don't we just embrace aristocracy? Why not create an oligarchy, the rule of the few, the rule of the elite, the rule of the aristocrats, right? Why not do that? We ate, right? We can divide the nation of Persia up into ourselves. We can be we can have various powers. You can be in charge of the army, Darius. I'll be in charge of the treasury. Our fellow comrade over there, he'll be in charge of the Royal Road, the Pony Express, etc., etc. Right? And we can just kind of divide and we can share, and it'll be this great situation which will enable all of us to maintain our power, and which will ensure that no one of us individually acquires greater power. So it'll be this very sort of fraternal, collaborative way of ruling. And Darius says, don't be daft, don't be obtuse, don't be a fool. Right? You know the nature of human nature more than anybody else, because you yourself are an aristocrat. And by virtue of being an aristocrat, you know what it is to have power. And those who have power, there's one inexorable, axiomatic, undeniable truth about those who have power. They always want more. What do all men with power want? We only wanted more. That's a quote from the Iliad. And I don't know if Darius was quoting the Iliad, probably not, but he might as well have been, because Herodotus is just putting all kinds of words in his mouth, so he could be saying anything. We might as well, insert some dialogue from Star Wars in there. And so Darius is basically saying, well, the point against the argument, the substantive argument against aristocracy or oligarchy, rule of the elite or rule of the few, is to say, by virtue of our being aristocrats, by virtue of our being wealthy and prominent and powerful and prestigious and having all these men and servants, etc., is that we have this voracious appetite for more power. That is who we are. It is an inextricable component of our nature. It is an inextricable component of human nature. If you get some, you always want more. Give him an inch, he'll take a mile, right? That is the nature of human nature. Okay, that is inarguable. It is irrefutable. It is irrefragable. And if in fact you conclude that that is in fact the way we are, right, then we nobles are even worse. We're even more avaricious. We're even more voracious in our appetites for greater power. And what will end up happening, dear brother who advocates on behalf of aristocracy and oligarchy, what will end up happening, I'm Darius here, I'm ventriloquizing for Darius, what will end up happening is that we will descend into a state of civil war and absolute chaos, and we will end up destroying the state from within. Because there will be a great deal of infighting amongst ourselves over who is the preeminent aristocratic or oligarchical power. And we will fight amongst ourselves, and it evolve into this constant cycle of civil war and civil distress and civil chaos. And that will be obviously incongruous with the best and highest interests of the state, as well as the people who are its constituents. And so the nobles are getting kind of tired of listening to Darius prove how smart he is, and they say, well, you think you're so haughty and high and mighty, O Darius. You have the impudence and the insolence, the arrogance to criticize so blatantly our various wise philosophical propositions in terms of how we could conceivably rule the state. Well, what say you, Darius? What is your answer? Well, of course, Darius knows exactly. This is the whole reason why he's categorically repudiating these various theories that have been advanced and espoused before he comes along, because he knows what he wants to say. And he says, what is Persia? What is Persia? What has Persia always been? Persia is no different than Assyria that came before it, or the Neo-Babylonian Empire that came before it, or the Chaldeans that came before them, all the way back to all the rulers since ancient Mesopotamia. What form have all these great states taken? Kingship, autocracy, monarchy. And that is the answer, my friends. Because, in the words of the great Joaquin Phoenix, communist from the movie Gladiator, the greatest movie ever made, it takes an emperor to rule an empire. Now, whether or not Darius actually said that, I would like to believe that he did, but probably not, because he probably didn't see Gladiator, because it came out 2,500 years after he died. But that's the point that he's trying to make. He basically says that in order to ensure that we maintain proper executive functioning of this government, so as to ensure that we expeditiously disseminate orders to the soldiers, so that we can respond effectively to any external or indeed internal threat, we need to have an executive that has the power to do so in an unrestrained, unrestricted, unmitigated fashion. And in order to do that, we must vest this executive with extraordinary powers to act in a discretionary manner, uninhibited, unrestrained, unfettered by the deliberations of the people, who obviously will be obfuscated in their own ignorance and stupidity. And we also want a ruler who's going to be unrestrained by the deliberations of his fellow aristocrats, who only seek their own gratification. And therefore, we need to choose a wise ruler, a just ruler, a man who has proven himself. And what better way than to leave this process to the fate of the discretion of the gods? Let us appeal to the gods, my fellow nobles. Let us allow fate and destiny and providence to decide for us. I don't submit, because of course the nobles are going to turn to Darius, as they invariably did. They say, well, Darius, who is it that you have in mind to be this great, noble, and wise king, who we can trust with the affairs of the state, to have unilateral executive functioning power? Darius says, well, I wouldn't be so insolent as to dare propose myself. And they'll say, well, of course, you wouldn't do that. Well, how do you propose we resolve this? Who amongst us is worthy of aspiring to rule? Who amongst us is worthy of following the glorious footsteps of Cyrus, who came before all of us? And Darius says, I have a proposal, my fellow nobles. Here it is. Here's the proposition. Here's Darius' way of resolving who it is that's going to be chosen by the gods. Let's leave it to fate. Let's leave it to chance. Usually in the olden days, in the days of of Homer, the of Odysseus and Achilles and Hector, they would roll the dice. You know, they'd either roll the dice or they would do what's known as the throwing of the taking of lots. All right, they throw their rings. These various kings would have signet rings, and they'd close their eyes and they'd throw their rings up in the air all at once simultaneously, and they'd have a vase or something sitting on the floor, and whoever's ring landed in the vase or the pot or nearest the pot was he who was chosen by fate or destiny or providence of the gods or whatever it was. He thought it was the operation of divine will. Well, Darius says, I'm going to get inventive and creative, right? We have these rings, we could play that game, but I think it's a better game. I have a better proposition. Here's a more fascinating and invigorating game. How about this? We nobles, we all line up on our horses, and we line up before the morning dawn, before the sun rises in the east. We get on our horses and we line up. We line up like a bunch of NASCAR, right? And we're on the line. Okay, we draw a line in the sand, and we're all up on our horses. And what we're going to do is we're going to observe as the sun is rising over the desert sands in the east. We nobles are going to observe which of our horses rears up and neighs and recognizes the rising of the sun first. And he whose horse makes the requisite horse noise, right? The right, that's a horse noise, right? He whose horse does that will be deemed to be he who is chosen by the gods to rule over us. What say you, brother nobles? Is this a fair way of adjudicating this vexatious problem before us as to who is going to assume the right, the power of ruler? And the other nobles, they say, well, you know, we can't think of anything better than that. That's a pretty creative ploy you have there, Darius. Unbeknownst to the fellow nobles, however, because Darius is a sneaky, plotting, scheming individual, and very savvy and very clever. He's a trickster in disguise. He's like Loki. He secretly has an agreement with his slave, and so the slaves stand around the horses. They hold the horses in place. Darius says to his slave, so the moment, come here, slave. What I want you to do is when the moment the dawn breaks, the moment the sun comes up over those desert hills over there, I want you to sneak around behind my horse and slap it on its ass real quick, right? But inconspicuously, so these other nobles don't notice that you did this, and therefore my horse will presumably react, and that'll be the reaction that they're all looking for, because they'll think it's the gods, when in actuality it's just me scheming with you. And as luck would have it, that's exactly what actually happens. That's what transpires, right? So the sun is rising in the east. The 8 nobles are sitting there on their horses. They're all sitting there. The horses aren't doing anything. They're just kind of looking around for, I don't know, fodder to eat or whatever. And Darius's slave covertly and surreptitiously sneaks around the backside of his horse, and he slaps it on its ass, and the horse rears up and makes a neighing sound. And the other nobles look at Darius and his horse, and they say, ah, it is truly destined by the gods. The gods have chosen noble Darius. Look, the sign is undeniable. Now, that's the problem with all these mystical beliefs, is that oftentimes, I would say more often than not, in fact, almost exclusively, they have some very natural explanation, even though they ostensibly appear to be supernatural. In their connotation, they have a natural explanation, and oftentimes it's a fraudulent one as well. And so too it was the case with Darius. So Darius acquires the right to rule. He at least acquires the assent and the consent of his fellow nobles, who are the most important people in the kingdom. So that's all that really matters. These are the guys that control the armed forces. These are the guys that control, you know, all the power in the state. He is able to acquire their support to get them on board with authorizing and assenting to his right to rule by virtue of employing deceit and trickery to achieve this ill-begotten gain, right? So Darius, by his very nature, has acquired this power through deceptive practices, through fraudulent misrepresentation would be the words, the connotation that we would apply to that now in the 21st century. All right. Now Darius has a problem. Okay, so he's acquired this problem, or he's acquired this power, but he has a problem, and the problem is this: there are pretenders. Okay, remember, some of the pretenders were executed by Darius and his fellow 7 nobles, but some of them are still out there. Okay, we got the fake brother of Cambyses, right? Fake Cambyses' brother. You got the priest. Okay, And you got other guys, right? You got other people going around, right? Because they figure, well, if there's these two pretenders and they have no legitimate claim to the throne, it might as well be me. And so there's a lot of other illegitimate pretenders claiming to have the legitimate right to actually inherit the power of the throne of the king of Persia, the king of all the kings, the king of the four corners of the world. And Darius can't simply expect that all the people in Persia are going to bow down on a, without unquestioningly and worship and acknowledge him as the rightful ruler merely because he had this contest with these other nobles and his horse was the one that reared up and his horse was the one that acknowledged the fact that the dawn was rising up the east. He can't expect every single peasant in Persia to acknowledge that by virtue of that and that alone, that gives him the right to rule over everybody. That's many people say, well, that's inconsequential. You guys, you nobles, you 8 nobles, Darius and you 7 nobles, you had this agreement amongst yourselves, but nobody else was privy to that agreement. You did that without our knowledge, without our knowing, without our assent, without our recognition of the legitimacy of that process. And so there were a lot of people who would obviously have been in doubt of the legitimacy of the claim that Darius is making in asserting his right to actually take over the throne of Persia. Okay, so let's see where we're at here. The first year of Darius's rule, which is, by the way, in case you care about the dates, and I don't see why anybody you would actually care about the dates, because I don't concern myself with when this stuff actually happens. All I care about is whether or not you know what's happening. Are you able to explain these things? That's what I care about. But the first year of Darius' rule was 522 BC. And it was filled with all sorts of revolts and rebellions because the people believed that Darius didn't actually have the right to rule for obvious reasons. Okay, he wasn't a descendant of Cyrus, and the arrangement that him and his fellow nobles made was not something that the people were privy to. They weren't aware of it. They didn't agree to it. They couldn't agree to it because they weren't aware of it. And so what happens is you have all sorts of rebellions that begin to proliferate across Persia. And Persia is a very, very big place. And so this is a problem. And so what happens, one of the most serious rebellions takes place in Babylon. It's serious for a couple of reasons. First of all, Babylon is one of the capitals of ancient Persia. As I said, ancient Persia had 4 capitals: Persepolis, Susa, Babylon, and I can't remember the fourth. But it had 4 capitals. Okay, and if you have a rebellion or a revolt in one of your capitals, well, that communicates very conspicuously, I think, that you as the new king have a serious problem maintaining order in your state. If you can't maintain order and control the people in one of your own constituent capitals, then what does it say about your capacity to control the people that are out there beyond the realm of the capital, right? Far away from the bureaucracy and the apparatus of the governance in the state, right? What does it say about the people in the lesser cities, in the towns, in the villages, and the hamlets? Well, it says that they can basically riot and rebel with impunity if the people in Babylon, one of the preeminent cities of the empire, can get away with this, or are getting away with it anyways. So Darius realizes he's got to do something about this. He has to respond quickly and decisively and without any mercy, mercilessly. So what does he do? Well, the other problem with Babylon is that it's a city that has these enormous walls. It's surrounded by these very huge walls, and the walls are dozens of meters tall. They're 50 or 60 feet tall. Okay, and they're very large, and they're very robust, and they're very resilient, and they're virtually impenetrable using the technology of the ancient world. Anyways, you're throwing big rocks and things at the walls. You're not going to be able to knock those walls down. So that's another problem. And Babylon was a very big city. It was a very well-provisioned city. They had a lot of food. They had a lot of resources. They had a fresh water supply because the river runs through there, etc. And so this made it a very dangerous place because it could take the rebellion could spread. If Darius was unsuccessful in suppressing this rebellion, then it would only encourage other cities to embrace the rebellious attitude towards this new king. And Darius realizes that this is a sort of a critical moment in time, right? This is a cathartic moment. He has to be able to establish definitively that he not only has the right to rule, okay, but he has the means by which to secure that right against the possibility of any challenge which may conceivably divest him of that right. So it's not just a matter of, well, I've got the right to rule because we had this horse name contest and my horse won, right? It's not just that. But not I mean, he can assert that, okay, and there's a lot of stupid, ignorant people, superstitious people that would, in fact, maybe they believe that, right? But that's not enough, right? He's got to be able to reinforce that assertion of power by or assertion of authority by demonstrating that he has the power, he has the practical political power to actually effectuate that rule. So this goes to the difference of having de jure authority versus de facto authority, right? De jure authority is the right to rule or the right to claim anything, any right, whatever you're claiming, by right of law. Okay, you have the right to claim this thing, this benefit or this advantage because the law gives you that right. Okay, de facto authority is a different kind of authority, right? It's saying that you have authority or you have an entitlement, whatever it is, because in fact you have this, right? Because the real world dynamics are such that you have the power or the capacity to ensure that you can actually defend this right or this whatever this entitlement is that you actually are asserting you have access to or the right to. So it's like saying, does the governor of Michigan have de jure authority? Does Gretchen Whitmer have de jure authority? Well, she has authority. In law, she has authority. Well, actually, no, that's no longer true because the Supreme Court of Michigan actually ruled against her. And they said you've overextended the boundaries of your executive authority. But assuming that wasn't in fact the case, she had de jure authority. Does she have de facto authority? Well, probably not. Not in a lot of places, right? Because a lot of people disobey her orders. They don't adhere. They don't defer to the mandates, right? At this point in time, Darius may have de jure authority, okay, but he hasn't established that he has de facto authority, right? Because there's all these rebellions going on, and Babylon is a very conspicuous illustration of this rebellious lack of control, is what is demonstrated here, right? And so Darius realizes that he's got to put down this rebellion very, very quickly and very successfully, so as to assert for himself the capacity to enforce his lawful right to rule, right? It's not merely enough to say that I have the right to rule by virtue of the fact that the gods saw fit that I have the right to rule, but you also have the means by which to effectuate that rule. The means by which to impose that rule is necessary. So Darius and his army arrive at the gates of Babylon, and it's said that they spend a long time trying to dig under the walls. They try to throw things at the walls. They try to negotiate with the defenders, offer them some sort of reprieve, good terms, etc. And the defenders continuously and consistently rebuff all these various offers. Darius is inclined to be lenient. He says, if you open up these gates to this great city now, if you let my soldiers in, I promise that I will behave myself honorably, and I will allow you to continue to retain your rights as citizens, and I will not infringe upon your rights, etc., etc. Well, the Babylonians believed that he was talking shit, or they thought that it doesn't matter because either way you're not going to get in here. And so they continued to hold out in defiance of Darius. And the longer they held out, the worse it makes Darius look. It makes it look as though he's incapable of actually securing his own realm, asserting his own authority. And the more and more infuriated he becomes, the more consternating the situation is. And so eventually it gets to a point where one of Darius's high-ranking generals, one of his high-ranking officers, comes to Darius. This guy's name was Zopyrus. Okay, Zopyrus. And Zopyrus, you don't need to know his name. And Zopyrus comes to Darius and he says, "Great king, allow me to covertly sneak into the walls of Babylon one of these nights and represent myself as a traitor against the Persians, and then to deceive those Babylonians, those devious and disrespectful Babylonians, into believing that I am actually a friend of theirs, and they will welcome me into the city, and then I can, through my own machinations and my own clever ploys, I can get them to trust me enough where I can perhaps help you from within. I can be the enemy behind enemy lines. I can be like Owen Wilson in that stupid movie that they made about him 20 years ago." And Darius says, "Oh no, I value you, Zopyrus. You're a very good, loyal, trusted advisor. I don't want to risk the possibility of losing you, because if you went over there to the walls, inside the walls and you stuck in there at night, the Babylonians are going to know that you snuck in there, and they're going to ask, what are you doing here? And they're not going to believe you if you go in there and just tell them that, oh yeah, and the Persians kicked me out of here, and because I was talking trash about Darius, and I was saying the Babylonians actually have a rightful precedent to revolt. The Babylonians won't believe you, and they'll probably execute you. And I can't afford to lose one of my noble generals. I'm not going to risk your life, Zopyrus. So Zopyrus goes back to his tent. He thinks about what Darius just told him, and he thinks to himself, well, how can I convince the Babylonians to let me in? Well, Darius was right. I can't just go in there and say, believe me. They're not going to give me the benefit of the doubt. I'm a Persian. Why would they do that? So what Zopyrus does is he begins to inflict all sorts of grievous wounds upon himself. He takes a knife and he begins to cut across his face and underneath his chin and around his nose. And he begins to self-mutilate. He begins to mutilate himself. And he looks like I don't know, he looks like Quasimodo or something, right? He looks like this guy who's deformed, and he's mutated. He's got all this conspicuous deformities about his face because he's taken this knife and he's horribly maligned his otherwise good-looking, handsome, aesthetic features. And he goes back to the king, Darius, and he says, look at what I've done. Look at how much I love you, Darius. Look at how much I love Persia. And look, I was willing to sacrifice my face for the sake of Persia. And Darius looks at him as though he's insane, rightfully so, because that would take a certain degree of insanity to do that. And Darius begins to weep. He says, why would you do this to yourself, Zopyrus? You were a good-looking guy. I thought you were a nice, handsome guy. Why would you mutilate yourself in such an egregious way? And Zopyrus says, well, my king, because now if I present myself to those degenerate hooligans over there behind those walls over there in Babylon, now they will believe me, because they will see that the Persians have ostensibly inflicted such terrible punishments upon me. They have inflicted these terrible wounds on my face, and they have mutilated me to the extent that I have mutilated myself. And the Babylonians will have to believe me, because what sane man would actually do this to himself? And Darius says, that's a pretty fair point. That's a good point. You're right. You're right, Zopyrus. You literally would have to be insane to have to do that to yourself. And which says more about Zopyrus' sanity than it does anything about else. And so Zopyrus, true to form, true to his plan, he's able to sneak into the walls, sneak through the walls at night, and he's able to insinuate himself into the good graces of the defenders of Babylon. And he's able to convince them that this mutilation of his face was actually inflicted upon him involuntarily by the Persians, because he was actually secretly, covertly trying to help the Babylonians. And such was his love for their cause, and such was his self-sacrificial commitment to their cause, that he was willing to subject himself to this terrible mutilation that the Persians ostensibly inflicted upon him. And the Babylonians believe him, not unreasonably so. And what ends up happening is this, I should say that the story ends up being a parallel or a parody of the story that we see being told by Homer in the Iliad and the Odyssey. And Homer tells about the Trojan horse, and the Greeks used the Trojan horse to sneak into the city of Troy, and then their special forces commandos unit was inside the Trojan horse, and they rappelled down from the horse at night after it was inside the city. This is a great big wooden horse, and then they opened up the gates. They slayed the guards, and they opened up the gates, and then the city of Troy was sacked and pillaged, and the people were enslaved and murdered. And that's pretty much exactly what happens in the context of the Babylonian revolt. That's the end point of the Babylonian revolt, is that this guy Zopyrus, who mutilates himself, who comes in there and presents himself as having been mutilated by the Persians, he convinces the Babylonians to trust him. And not only do they trust him enough to actually permit him to be amongst them, but they trust him so much, because he's such a clever and conniving and convincing, sneaky son of a gun, they trust him so much to actually give him command over one of their main gates, the entranceways of the city, the ingress of the city. And so Zopyrus, this guy who's mutilated and inflicted all these terrible wounds on his face, he's able to command one of the gates. And one night, he tells his soldiers, have yourself some wine, men. Go out there to the bar and have a few drinks, and I myself will guard this gate. and his troops go out there. They say, well, you're Zopyrus. You're one of the most loyal Babylonians because you were so loyal to Babylon that you had the Persian inflict all these wounds upon your face. That's a test of your loyalty. So we're gonna go ahead and obey you because we believe you. And these guys, they leave the gate, and what does Zopyrus do? He opens up the gates. He opens up the gates, and all the Persian soldiers that have been waiting outside under the command of Darius, who have been waiting there for many, many days, many, many months, many, many weeks, waiting, besieging the city, growing more and more impetuous and more anxious and more frustrated day by day. They finally have the opportunity to get into the city, and they ransack it, and they terrorize it, and they enslave its people, or they kill its people. And it's a but it is a fair and perhaps not just, but I think it's a reasonable end to the people of Babylon who so insolently held out. And again, the other point about all this is that what Herodotus is doing is he's borrowing from a story that was told by an ancient Greek bard, not a poet, but a bard, a guy who would travel around to various taverns and bars and tell stories, right? A bard, that's what a bard does. And Herodotus is borrowing this story, and he's changing the names, he's changing the proper names, he's changing certain elements of it, but it conforms generally to the contours of the story of the war between the Greeks and the Trojans as told by Homer in the Iliad and the Odyssey. So he's just, again, this is a recapitulation of a story that came well before. But what we do know is that there probably is some factual authenticity to the story. There was this Babylonian revolt. Whether or not there was this guy Zopyrus that mutilated his face and went in there and snuck around and opened up the gate secretly and surreptitiously, well, probably not. Okay, who knows? I guess anything's possible, but that's what happened. Okay, so that's the revolt of Babylon. Now the next thing that happens is Darius realizes that it's not just enough. It's not merely enough to put down a rebellion of those who challenge your right to rule. That's one way of asserting your power. But there are other ways too. And perhaps the best way of showing that you actually have the right to rule, that you have the, not just the right to rule, but you have the capacity to rule. You are capable and qualified by virtue of your own personal attributes and your character. The best way to assert that, undeniably so, is to go out there and to demonstrate your military prowess. And so, what Darius ends up doing is he decides that he's going to go up and he's going to conquer people that live across the Bosphorus, which is a sea. It's a sea. It's a body of water. And what Darius does is he decides that he is going to attempt to accomplish what Cyrus the Great founder, the progenitor of the Achaemenid dynasty, the great founder of Persia, what Cyrus the Great tried but failed to do himself: the conquest of the Scythians. And the Scythians, as you guys will remember, live up in modern day Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, places like that. But to get to that area, to successfully get to that area, what you have to do if you're the Persians, if you're coming from modern day Anatolia, which is modern day central Turkey, or Iran, or Iraq, or anywhere else that falls under the auspices of ancient Persia, to get there, you've got to cross the Bosphorus, which is the straits that separate Europe and Asia. Okay, and this is where the Caspian Sea meets the far eastern precincts of the Aegean Sea. So for those who are geographers amongst you, I don't know. Ordinarily, I would draw a map, but the map would be so crude, and you wouldn't be able to tell what I was even drawing because my drawing on the board is so horrible. But just imagine where modern day Macedonia is, and probably none of you guys actually know where that's at. Well, if you do, that's what we're talking about. It's north of it's in central Turkey. Oh, I know where it's at. It's modern day Ankara, the capital of Turkey, is where it's at, or Istanbul. What am I talking about? Istanbul. And that's where Darius decides to build this boat bridge. Now, the significance of the boat bridge is twofold. First of all, nobody had ever conceived of building a boat bridge before in the history of the world, as far as we know. Now, why is that significant? Well, because before, you would have had to go the long way around, right? It's like the Panama Canal, okay? Think about it like that, right? I mean, why or the Suez Canal? What did the Suez Canal do? What did it enable mariners and seafarers to do that they couldn't have done before? Well, it saved them having to go all the way around the far west coast of Africa, all the way down the Cape of Good Hope, uh, down by Johannesburg in South Africa, and which was extremely dangerous, very treacherous waters, a lot of ships sunk in that area. It saved them weeks of travel time, right? It's a much more expeditious and efficient means of getting from A to B. Okay, so it has that going for it. But I think it also demonstrates the power of the Persians, the engineering prowess of the Persians. Look, we were able to design and implement this thing that nobody had ever really done before. Oh, that's significant. That says something about you guys, right? But furthermore, it creates a precedent, right? Because now we know that we can build boat bridges, and if we've done it once, we can do it again. And so, what this is in the story that Herodotus tells about ancient Persia and these various kings who are all interconnected in some way, shape, or form, is that this is sort of establishing a continuity between Darius and his son. We're spent a lot of time talking about his son is Xerxes, and you guys who have seen the movie 300 and the successor to 300, Rise of an Empire, you'll remember Xerxes, okay, because Xerxes was the primary antagonist in that film. He was this big giant guy that was like 8 feet tall, and he looked rather ridiculous because he had his head shaved. He was wearing all kinds of bling. But that was Xerxes. Xerxes emulates his father Darius. He also builds a boat bridge, which is much more strategically significant than the first boat bridge. But the first boat bridge that was built by Darius was sort of a prototype, right? And after this, now the Persians know how to build boat bridges, and they can employ this as a means by which to effectuate their strategic conquest subsequent to this time. Now the other question is why are you so voracious for conquest? Why does Darius think that he's got to go out there and he's got to conquer anybody? I mean, look, you would think that you would be contented with the fact that you're the ruler of the four corners of the world. You've got Babylon, you've got Syria, you've got Mesopotamia, you've got Egypt now, right? You got some of Egypt, anyways, right? You've most of Egypt, all of Egypt after Cambyses, right? You've got most of Anatolia, central day Turkey, right? You've got a lot of places, you got a lot of different kingdoms, a lot of constituent people. Why would you bother going out there and conquering other people? Why would you do that? Well, a lot of it has to do with the fact that you're Darius. Okay, this is particularized to the individual. Okay, if it was some other king, it may not have been the case, but it's because it's Darius, right? Now what does Darius have to do? Why does Darius have to do this? Well, because Darius feels as though he has to prove something. He has to prove that he is worthy of his predecessor. He needs to prove that he is worthy, not of his immediate predecessor, not of Cambyses, because that's easy to prove that you're more worthy than that guy. That guy was he's a sacrilegious tool. What do you have to do, though? You have to prove that you're worthy of the guy who came before Cambyses. You're worthy of the legacy, of inheriting the legacy and the power and the prestige and all the rights and entitlements of Cyrus the Great. And what better way to do that than to go out there and achieve what Cyrus could not himself achieve, to subjugate these very proud people of the steppes, the Scythian warriors who are on horseback. What better way to establish that you actually have the right to rule than by going out there and achieving that which the George Washington of the Persian Empire couldn't achieve himself? I think that's actually a pretty good idea. I mean, that's interesting. But then the counterpoint to that, of course, is, well, where does it stop? Where does it end? You say you want to go out there and you want to conquer the Scythians because that's something that Cyrus aspired to do, but he was unable to do. And so you're going to go out there and you're going to consummate the aspirations of Cyrus, but then you want more. And you have this unending, voracious appetite for more glory and more conquest and more power, and it's a never-ending cycle because it's always going to draw you in more and more. Again, the appetite for growth and for power grows with the eating. The voraciousness, the acquisitiveness becomes greater, more amplified, more exacerbated by virtue of the fact that you are successful in attaining and achieving whatever feats you aspire to achieve. So well, it encourages you to go out there and even be more imperialistic and domineering in your attitude towards other people. So I think it's an inescapable cycle that is very difficult to break. So Cyrus goes up to the Scythians and he confabulates. He creates this boat bridge in the process of doing so, and he's able to conquer most of the Scythians. So good for him. Now, did I say Cyrus? I meant Darius. Okay, we're talking about Darius. We're talking about Darius in reference to, in relation to Cyrus, however. Okay, we're talking about why is Darius doing what he's doing? He's not doing it because the Scythians are really a threat. He's merely doing it for the sake of, I would say, pride. I mean, again, he didn't learn from his predecessors. He didn't learn from his predecessors. Now, let's turn the page. Actually, I think literally let's turn the page because let's see where we're at here. So I've been on this slide now for the past hour and 15 minutes, and I'm not going to go for 2 hours. I'm getting tired. We're going to finish this up in the next 15 minutes. I've been in this slide entitled Darius the Great, okay, and it's got his name on there. And now there's this slide with the ancient Persian Empire here. It just shows the extent of the Persian Empire. It shows how expansive it was. It shows just how large this kingdom was in relation to other great kingdoms and other great sovereign domains that were contemporaneous with it. And if you look at the Persian Empire, it's right there, sort of left of center in this slide. I'm looking at this. You guys can't see this very well. It doesn't matter. The slides aren't really that consequential, but I'm looking. It's kind of it's a relief map. Well, it's not a relief map. It's a sort of political map of Asia and Europe and Africa and Australia. I don't know why they have Australia on here. I don't even know why they have Africa on here. But it's a map of. I guess what this is showing is it's showing the various nation states or sovereign geopolitical entities which were contemporaneous with the empire of the Persians. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, this is around the time of Cyrus the Great. I like how this map was last updated on looks like December 15th of 2007. Because those ancient borders might change between then and now. Maybe they've changed. Who knows? I kind of doubt it. But I guess what you could look at though is you can contrast the sheer scale, the massive expansiveness of Persia with we got the various Chinese dynasties on this image. You can see the Zhao, who we spent a lot of time talking about. You can see the Dravidians, who are the people that were indigenous to the Indian subcontinent before the Indo-Aryans arrived there. You can see the Indo-Aryan kingdoms up there in the north of India, in modern-day Pakistan, and places like that. Yeah, you can see a lot on this map, right? But the point here is that all of those various places that I just mentioned, including ancient China, despite its size, despite how massive it was geographically, all those places could easily fit within the confines of the ancient Persian Empire. Very big place. All right. Let's talk about the Persian Greco Wars, as they're known as. The wars between Persia and Greece. And I think I alluded to this a while ago, but the history, the beginning of the confrontation between Greece and Persia has sort of a legendary mythical connotation to it, as do many of these stories, because again, they originate from the mind of an ingenious storyteller, Herodotus, but one who's very inventive and one who has sort of a contemptuous disregard for the value of the truth, or at least the objective value of the truth, right? We're going to just misconstrue things and add sort of sensational embellishments to the extent that we think is necessary. And one of the sensational embellishments that Herodotus adds is this sort of mythological inflection that is imputed to the origins of this great conflict. And what Herodotus tries to do is he tries to go all the way back to the first point in time that he can think of, the beginning of, as far as the Greeks were concerned, the beginning of recorded history, when the original sin was committed. Okay, the original sin was committed, and what Herodotus is trying to do is he's trying to do this sort of ex post facto analysis, whereby he's retrospectively trying to attribute blame and culpability to one side more so than the other. Now you can probably infer which side that is. Of course, he wants to say that the Persians or their historical ancestors are the ones who inspired all of this, right? If you trace it back to its incipient point of origin, then this must have began by virtue of some offense, some egregious offense that was committed by those who occupied the area which is now inhabited by Persians. There's a couple of problems with that. Well, before I digress into the problems with that, let's actually talk about the offense itself. So, for those of you who have seen the movie Troy, Brad Pitt, and not Angelina Jolie, who else was in that? Brad Pitt. Oh, the guy who plays the Hulk, Eric Bana, some other people, I can't remember who. Good movie, very good movie. And for those of you who don't, and for those of you who actually know the story of Odysseus and the Iliad, and the story of the Trojan Wars, you wouldn't have to have seen that movie because you'll know it, because you probably would have learned it from the proper source itself. Well, you will remember, and those of you who don't remember this, don't worry, because I'm going to tell you what happens, right? The Trojan Wars began originally, the fundamental offense that inspired the war between ancient Greece, right? This is, as far as the Greeks are concerned, this is the proto-history. Okay, this is reputed to have happened, I don't know, somewhere around 5,000-6,000 years ago. Okay, so thousands of years before the period that we're actually talking about right now, involving Cyrus and Darius and these guys. Many thousand years before, there was this great war between the forces of Greece and the forces of what at that time was known as Troy. But Troy, not the city in Michigan, southeastern regional Detroit area, the ancient city of Troy. And the ancient city of Troy just so happened to be situated in what is now, at this particular time that we're talking about, this the time of Darius, it's situated in the lands of Persia. Okay, so it's an eastern city. It's in modern day Turkey is where it's at. What happened was that the Trojans were invited by the Greeks, the Spartans to be precise, were one of the constituent Greek city-states at the time. They are invited for peace talks to ameliorate their historical differences that existed between them, because there was some historical animosity between these people because they had fought each other over the years. And the king of Sparta, brother of Agamemnon, who was the great king of all the Greeks at the time, and I can't remember the name of the king of Sparta, and I should have known this because I just watched this on Netflix a couple of weeks ago. But anyways, the king of Sparta, which is again one of the Greek city-states, invites the Trojans to come and to break bread with him, as a demonstration of his affinity and respect for his historical enemies, and as a way to conciliate and ameliorate the differences between them, so that they can go forward and be peaceful from now on. And what do the Trojans do? They repay his hospitality by stealing his wife, Helen of Troy, because before she was Helen of Troy, she was Helen of Sparta. She was the wife of the king of Sparta. They steal, they misappropriate, they abscond with the wife of the king of Sparta, who invited the Trojans into his city, into his royal home, to break bread with him and to drink wine with him, and etc. They steal the wife of this great king of Sparta. And hence this was, as far as Herodotus was concerned, this was the first offense. Okay, this is the beginning point, right? We trace this back. We're trying to trace the etymology, the origin point of this conflict, this inexorable, historical, unending cycle of violence and animosity between East and West, East Persia on the one hand and West Greeks on the other, right? We're trying to trace this back to the incipient point where it began. And Herodotus is trying to make the case that, I'm going to tell you why I don't believe it's a very convincing case in a minute here, but he's trying to make the case that this all began when Helen was absconded with, right? Absconded by, misappropriated by the Trojans, and that she went off in the night with them. Well, first of all, I would say she went willingly, okay, and there's some factual reports that her relationship with her husband was an abusive one, but these are all superfluous facts. I would say the primary refutation of what Herodotus is attempting to insinuate here is to say that, so what? Okay, first of all, even the Greeks at this time, they accepted that most of what happened in the Trojan Wars, which is the period that we're talking about with respect to this Helen of Troy being abducted from Sparta by these guys who inhabited what was before Persia, was Troy. Right? This was quasi-legendary. Even to these people, okay, who were living in the time of Darius, they didn't believe They didn't believe that every single word that Herodotus, or that every single word that Homer had told, or every single word that was written down, if it was written by this time of the story of the Odyssey and the Iliad, that every aspect of it was factual and true and consistent with the historical record. They didn't believe that, right? So if some of this is quasi factual, is pseudo legendary, some of it is ambiguous in terms of its historical and factual certitude, then you might as well impute that to the bit about the whole stealing the wife away from the Spartans, right? Who's to say that that's not made up? Who's to say that that's not just something that, that was an embellishment that Homer added onto the story to make it more salacious, because it's more interesting if it's a fight over a woman, because Helen was said to be so beautiful that she had the face that launched 1,000 ships. That's what it was said about her. So apparently she was pretty hot. As far as these guys are concerned, right? I don't know. I don't care. It doesn't really matter. But going back to the point here. So number one, much of this is the Greeks themselves at the time of Darius, right? The contemporaneous Greeks at the time of Darius. Much of them would have acknowledged and conceded full well that some of the stories from Homer must be fictitious, right? Not all of them, right? But some of that was fictionalized, okay? It was sort of a historical drama, but there was elements of fiction that were interjected into it, right? So it's kind of like Gladiator, right? Nobody would say, I'm going to go out there and watch Gladiator, Ridley Scott's magnificent production, the greatest movie of all time, in my humble opinion, and say that that is a completely factually accurate and highly consistent rendering of the story of General Maximus Decimus Meridius, right? Well, the first problem is that Russell Crowe's character, the primary protagonist of the movie, didn't actually exist historically. He's a composite character. He's a composite of multiple characters. But that's just for starters. Okay, I could go on and on and on. Now that's kind of the problem with the story that Homer tells. Okay, so if some of this is quasi-factual, if some of this is pseudo-historical, if some of this is just fictitious and misrepresentations of the actual historical record, then who's to say that the bit about the wife stealing wasn't a bit of that fictional component of the story? Well, you don't know, and if you don't know, you have to assume that it was, right? Because if you assume that it wasn't, and then you impute that guilt, that collective moral culpability to the successors in time to the Trojans, the historical antecedents of the Trojans, which are the Persians later on, right? Well, then you're making an erroneous insinuation there. You're connecting a guilt to them. You're imputing guilt to them, which is rightfully not theirs, because this thing probably never happened to begin with. So that's the first problem. The second problem is to say, well, so what? Okay, even if we presuppose that this story about the Trojans going over to the Spartan king and having, sitting down and having wine and breaking bread with him, and then absconding with his wife in the middle of the night and taking her over to Troy, abducting his wife essentially, right? Even if that was all true, okay, granting that, okay, so what? There doesn't seem to be much of a connection, a cultural connection between the people who lived at that time in the city of Troy and the people who are living in Persia now. You can't say that they're directly or even linearly related, right? Maybe there's I can't even say there's some ethnic connection. There's certainly no cultural connection. There's very little in Trojan culture, right? The mythical, quasi-mythical Trojan culture that was being told about Homer in the Iliad and the Odyssey, and what later takes shape under Persia. There's very little connection between those two, right? So that's a very attenuated argument to make. Okay, it's a very difficult. It's not a very strong connection between the inhabitants of Persia in the time of Darius and the inhabitants of what was then Troy in the time of Odysseus and the Iliad, and this quasi-fictional story about these guys and this queen that was abducted from Sparta. So I think that that's another problem. And then the final problem is that, of course, Herodotus is looking at this through his subjective lens, and he's trying to contrive the facts in such a way so as to make it seem as though the original sin, okay, was the Persians, was what the Persians had themselves committed, okay, or their ancestors in time, and therefore they can't escape the sins of the fathers, right? You have to repay the debt of the debt of the fathers that is owed by the sons must be repaid by the sons, because the fathers had incurred it, and it's this idea of vicarious redemption, right? That you are somehow responsible for the sins of those who came before you, okay? And you got to somehow expiate that sin, right? I don't subscribe to that. I think you're responsible for your own personal deeds. You have agency, and if you act irresponsibly, then you're accountable for that action, right? But if you're not, if you can't say that you're responsible for what somebody else did, especially before your existence, right? And that's the other thing that Herodotus is essentially trying to impute to the Persians. He's saying that they're responsible fundamentally for that which came before them, okay? And I submit to you that that's a spurious argument, and that's not how people go about making cases against cultures. You can't indict a culture because of what came before them. This is like saying that modern day Germany, right? Everybody who lives in modern day Germany is collectively responsible for the guilt of the Holocaust. That there's still this collective guilt that is preeminent in Germany, and that we should all look at Germans as though they're a bunch of enablers of genocide. And nobody can make that argument with a straight face. I mean, I don't think that's a morally or intellectually convincing argument. I think that falls on its face. It's a non sequitur to say that. I think that's kind of what Herodotus is trying to do. Okay, so that's the fictional background, right, or the quasi-historical background. Now let's talk about the actual factual background, right? So what we actually know is that there's this guy named Aristagoras, okay, and his name is on the slide. Aristagoras was a tyrant, okay. Now tyranny, we all have this connotation that we associate with tyranny. Tyranny is associated with, Governor Gretchen Whitmer when she's overstepping her executive boundaries, etc. She's closing down the gyms, etc., etc. That's not actually what tyranny meant historically in the context in which we're talking about. An historical tyrant was merely a very convincing, very articulate, very eloquent, very compelling, very charismatic individual who was able to convince the people to give him essentially not completely unlimited power, but a great deal of executive power and executive control over the affairs of the state. And usually he was a member of the aristocracy. Usually he was an aristocrat. But he was able to, because he was, again, very, very cunning, very smooth, convincing, persuasive political operator. He's a guy who was able to go before the people, whether it was an assembly of the ancient people in Sparta or wherever it happened to be. He's able to go before the people, and by virtue of his arguments, and by virtue of his logic, and by virtue of the fact that he's very convincing, he was able to compel the people, induce the people to surrender to him their own prerogative, right? Their own prerogative, control their own affairs, and submit to him and say, we trust you so much to be our sublime leader that we are going to give you virtually unlimited power, virtually unlimited control over the sovereign affairs of the state. And that essentially was what a tyrant was. Now, that doesn't have some invidious connotation. It doesn't mean that therefore, because you have this unrestrained executive authority, you're going to rule in a manner that is inconsistent with the interests of the people. You may be a very just tyrant. You may be a very reasonable and fair and equitable tyrant. But you could also be a very unjust tyrant, and you could live up to the connotation that this word has now in the 21st century. You could be a Saddam Hussein type tyrant. Of course, you could be any of those things. You could be either of those things. Now, Aristagoras was one such tyrant. Okay, he was one of these clever politicians who was able to deceive the people into giving him basically unfettered control over the affairs of the state. Aristagoras was a Greek, and the people of his city were also Greeks. The people in this city that he was ruling over, which I believe was named Salamis. No, it was Miletus. You don't know that because I don't even know that. I had to look at my cheat sheet over there to know that. Well, anyways, he's the tyrant of the city called Miletus. Okay, and this is a Greek city-state. It's in what was known as Ionia, which is a province of ancient Greece. And Ionia was technically in Asia. Okay, so if you guys think about, and this is where I need my dry erase board because it's very, very difficult for me to show this just using, I don't know, hand puppets here. If you think about where modern day Turkey is, okay, modern day Turkey is kind of like it's central Anatolia, it's Central Asia, it's known as Asia Minor. It's right across from modern day Greece. Okay, there's this big piece of land that juts out from the Middle East, right, and it juts out into the Aegean and the Western and the Eastern Mediterranean, all right, and on the far peripheral area of that peninsula, it's kind of like a big peninsula that comes out, right, on the far western edges of that peninsula, that was known as the Ionian Greek area, okay, and that was inhabited by transplanted Greeks who originally came from places like Athens. Okay, so the guys who were living in this city-state Miletus, which is ruled over by this guy Aristagoras, this tyrant who was elected by the people, but he has unfettered control over the affairs of the state, right? These are essentially transplanted Athenians. They're people that came from Athens. They're like the colonists, right? The relationship that these people that are living in this Ionian city-state of Miletus, the relationship that they have to Athens is the relationship that the people who were living in the 13 colonies in the 1760s, whatever, right? The relationship that they had to Great Britain, okay, to England, to the British Empire, right? They were transplanted Englishmen. That's all they were. That's all they were ever. And that's essentially what the people who were living in Miletus was. Now, Aristogoras had a very unique and somewhat nuanced relationship with Persia. So his city state happened to be on sort of the very periphery, the very edge of the Persian Empire, okay? And because it was a Greek city state historically, and because the people that were living in that city state were originally from Athens, the Persians didn't want to interfere directly with the affairs of that city state and other cities that were similarly situated to it. They didn't want to go in there and give their, impose their own rulers and their own laws and just enslave those people. Because for a long time, the Persians actually, and this goes back to the arguments against the point that Herodotus is trying to make, for a long time, the Persians were very conscientious with respect to giving consideration to the rights and the sovereign interests of the Greeks. They didn't want to infringe upon or transgress against the interests of the Greeks. They couldn't afford to, all right? I mean, look, they're dealing with revolts in Babylon. They're going up there in Scythia and chasing after the people on the horses, the guys that are throwing the magic fruit in the fires and getting high on weed, right? They're doing all that, and then they're down in Egypt losing an army of 50,000 men. They're not, up until this point in time, if you look at this realistically and you reconcile the geopolitical machinations of Persia up until this time with the historical facts as we know them, the Persians haven't really had anything to do with Greece. And that's why up until this time, I haven't had a slide that has said Greco-Persian Wars. And we are talking about Greco-Persian Wars. Persia has no vested interest, has no material interest in Greece up until this point in time. So that would suggest that the Greeks do something to provoke the animosity of the Persians. And that's actually the point that I'm getting to. So, Aristogoras, he's this tyrant, and he has this relationship with Persia, and he's basically a proxy ruler for Persia. He's beholden to the Persians. The Persians give him the right and the power to rule. Well, they don't give him the power to rule because he derived the power from the people. He was able to convince the people that he was the right man for the job, and they went ahead and elected him. But the Persians say, we're not going to interfere with your rule of Miletus, the city-state that you're ruling over, Aristogoras. We're just going to let you go ahead and rule it. We're not going to interfere with that. Go ahead and rule it. You can be a tyrant. You can go ahead and live in your palace and tax the people up the wazoo. That's fine. We're not going to materially interfere with your sovereign affairs of state. And that was the agreement. And that was the agreement that the Persians had with Miletus and Aristogoras. And Aristogoras, in exchange, agreed to respect the Persians, to defer to the Persians, to obey the local Persian governor who was responsible for that area, and to not make war with the Persians. Now, Aristogoras' problem is that he's a very ambitious tyrant. Not only was he so ambitious that he was able to convince the people of Miletus to give him basically unfettered jurisdiction over their affairs, but he also decides that he's going to appeal to the Athenians. So he sends emissaries over to Athens, right? The Athenians is just the proper term for the denizens of people who live in Athens. Aristogoras sends emissaries across the Aegean, across the sea there, and they go over there to Athens, and the emissaries say, we are here on behalf of the tyrant Aristogoras, who superintends the affairs of you, the colonists who originate from Athens. Our petition here is simple. Aristogoras and his people of Miletus, the people who were formerly Athenians, and now they are the successors of the Athenians, they're the transplanted colonists from Athens, they seek liberty from the despotic enslavement of the Persians. And we humbly petition and employ you men, brave, courageous men of Athens, whose democratic sensibilities certainly inure in our favor. We petition you, we humbly solicit your favor and your assistance, your material military assistance, in fighting off and protecting ourselves against these Persians who would seek to terrorize and subjugate our lands. Now, of course, all of this is a terrible contriving and misrepresentation of the facts as they are. Because Miletus, the city-state that's under the rule of Aristogoras, isn't actually being enslaved by the Persians, right? That's the whole point, is that the Persians have an agreement with Aristogoras. he can basically do whatever he wants, so long as he's keeping the people there happy, as long as he's able to convince the people that he's the right man for the job. And the Persians basically say, hands off. You guys will tax you. Well, you're a quasi Persian state, but we're also going to allow you to maintain your Greek culture, your Greek traditions, your Greek language, your Greek gods, right, etc. Okay, so you're a semi-sovereign entity under the geopolitical influence, right, of Persia, and technically beholden to Persia, but we're not going to, we the Persians are not going to coercively mandate anything. We're not going to impose ourselves on you in a way that's deleterious to your interests. So I think that the Persians were actually treating these people in Miletus in a fairly innocuous and benign manner, a benevolent manner, right? In a way that did not really give rise to these kinds of criticisms that these emissaries were representing to the people of Athens. So these emissaries go there, and the irony is that the real tyrant here, the real guy who's benefiting from all of this, is in fact Aristagoras. He's got a good thing going for himself. He's the ruler of the city, right? He's got a lot of wealth, a lot of power, a lot of women, whatever, right? Riches, power, prominence, etc. All that he really wants, right? But yet he's so ambitious, he wants to inspire his fellow Greeks to come across the Aegean and to fight against the Persians so as to acquire more territory that he can ostensibly then rule over more cities, right? That's the idea. That's what he's thinking, right? He's going to get the Athenians, who, by the way, are democratic in their sensibilities, so they don't really agree. They don't like the way that Aristagoras is ruling his own city, because he's ruling his city like an autocrat. He's ruling his city like a monarch. He's technically a tyrant, right? But that's synonymous in many ways with being a king, right? It's a king for all intents and purposes, in all but word, right? It's a king for all, functionally, it's a king. And the Athenians Athens is the birthplace of democracy. And so the Athenians, again, the irony is that the Athenians are offering material military assistance to a fellow Greek who is in league with the Persians, who themselves represent, at least governmentally and philosophically, they represent the antithesis of democracy. They represent enslavement and absolute monarchical autocratic authority and absolute obseisance and obedience to a king, and all the things that are completely inimical to democratic sensibilities. That's irony number one. Irony number two is that they're helping out this guy Aristagoras, who himself is actually a tyrant. So he's ruling in a way that is completely antithetical to democratic sensibilities. He's not ruling his people in a democratic manner. He's managed to convince his people, or deceive them, or whatever, right, into giving him complete sovereign control over the affairs of his own city-state. But that means that he's essentially a king in all but name, as I said. So that's ironic, right? So whenever it's ironic, that usually suggests that there's something unsatisfactory about this, right? There's something that's not wholly consonant with good ethical norms about this situation. Because if it's ironic, then you could say it's slightly paradoxical. If it's slightly paradoxical, then you wouldn't be a stretch to say that maybe it's hypocritical as well. All right, and so what ends up happening is the Athenians, along with their allies from Eretria, this other city-state that's nearby Athens and in Greece proper, these city-states end up getting together, and they agree to offer material military aid to assist the Greek citizens of the city-state of Miletus under the rule of their tyrant Aristagoras in their plea for greater freedom and less restriction against the overlordship of Persia. And the form that this military assistance takes is 4,000 hoplites. And hoplites were the warriors of ancient Greece. And they carried these long spears. They had helmets. They had usually some kind of armor, usually leather. It wasn't very good armor. And they had these shields, sort of round circular shields. And we'll talk more about this in the context of the Battle of Thermopylae, which is still coming up. But they sent 4,000 of these guys across the Aegean. They get on their boats. They load up in the ships. They go across the Aegean. And what do? They attack the city of Sardis. Okay, so not the city of Miletus. Miletus is the city that Aristagoras is the tyrant, lords over. He's the tyrant of Miletus. They attack the city of Sardis, Sardis. And Sardis is actually the regional, provincial capital of the province, the Persian province, which corresponds with this area, which includes Asia Minor and these Greek city-states on the periphery, includes Miletus and Aristagoras and all his people. Right, so the Greeks come across from Athens and this other place, Eretria, the 4,000 hoplites. They come across the Aegean, and they begin attacking the city. And they eventually are fought off and defeated by the Persian military when it responds, because even though the Persians don't have a lot of soldiers in this area, they have more soldiers than the Greeks, and that was the first mistake the Greeks made, was to agree to support Aristogoras in any meaningful way, because he's obviously just trying to use them for his own nefarious personal interests. I mean, if the Athenians couldn't see that, then, well, quite frankly, they're pretty obtuse. That was the first mistake. And secondly, if you're going to offer some kind of military support for somebody, make sure that it's support that is sufficient to accomplish the mission. And that's rule number one, military science 101. And I know this because I spent 3 years learning about military science at ROTC. Rule number one is make sure you have the means, the material, and the material and the human means by which to effectuate or actualize your operational objectives. Right. So the Athenians and the Eretrians, their allies, these Greek city-states, they didn't send enough guys. They only sent 4,000 men. That was not nearly enough. Okay. And these guys, they go into the city of Sardis, and what do they end up doing? Well, they end up sacking the city, going about ransacking, pillaging, stealing a bunch of shit, right? Violating the rights of the people that are living there, killing certain people, taking slaves, etc., doing all the sorts of things that a conquering army is doing. And in the course of sacking and ransacking and pillaging the city, what they also do, not only do they lose the battle after the fact, right? The Greeks end up losing the battle against the Persians, which is bad enough, right? So they didn't have justice of their cause, and they lost the battle, right? But they add insult to injury, okay? The profound insult that was inflicted upon the sensibilities of all righteous, self-respecting Persians was what happens during the ransacking of the city of Sardis, which, by the way, is the regional capital of this Persian province. The Greeks, either inadvertently, unwittingly, unknowingly, involuntarily, or intentionally, which is even worse, intentionally, either negligently or intentionally, either way it's bad, right? Either negligently or intentionally, they ended up burning down the temple to the Persian gods that was located there in the city-state of Sardis. They burned down the temple in the course of their ransacking around the various places in the city. Now, the temple is the house of the gods of ancient Persia, just like the gods of ancient Greece, just like the gods of ancient Mesopotamia or ancient Egypt or wherever, or even modern day Christian God, right? It is a house of God. That, like your local church or your synagogue or your mosque, I know you don't have a lot of mosques up there in Houghton, right? But your local place of worship is a house of God, and so too was that temple. That was a house of God which the gods of the ancient Persians were metaphysically inhabiting, okay? And if you burn down a temple, that is a terrible, egregious sacrilege that is committed against the gods. And it is so egregious, and it is such a righteous indignation that it is essentially equivalent to what Cambyses did when he went down to Egypt. Personally committing deicide, killing a god, right? It's equivalent to, in terms of just how egregious, just how offensive, just how morally opprobrious this act happens to be. And what is really bad about this is that this happens at a time that is very fortuitous for Persia to be able to mobilize all of its resources, strategic military resources, and organize a campaign against the Greeks. Because think about it this way: who do the Persians have left to fight and to destroy? They've already conquered and subjugated the Egyptians. They've just recently conquered and subjugated the Babylonians. That's no longer a threat. They have no longer any internal threats to their security and stability. They really don't have any external threats to their security and stability, because the Egyptians are gone, thanks to not very much thanks to Cambyses, but a little bit thanks to Cambyses, right? And so too are the Scythians, right? So the Persians have gotten to the point where they ran out of good people to fight. They ran out of legitimate targets to fight. And so they started going after illegitimate targets to fight, right? The only reason Darius went up to Scythia in the first place was essentially because he was bored, right? Because he wanted to emulate the greatness of Cyrus, who came before him. He wanted to show and prove himself through military valor and through his conquest that he had the right to claim the power and the authority over these people of Persia. And the best way to establish and to reinforce that right is by going out there and conquering people who up until that point were unconquerable or unconquered. So Persia's ran out of people to conquer. So this is a very fortuitous, opportune, propitious time for the Greeks to commit this righteous indignation, this terrible sacrilege, this offense against the universal sensibilities of all good, self-respecting, venerable Persian citizens who have any regard for the gods whatsoever. This gives the Persians the casus belli, as the Romans would have referred to as, or as the pretext, the reason for the war, okay? The reason for the war, the justification that they were looking for. And I grant, I will fully concede that it was only a matter of time, okay? It wasn't a matter of if the Persians would eventually get around to attacking Greece. No, it was a matter of when. Now, this just sort of accelerates their timetable, right? Because now they can say, you nefarious, disrespectful, sacrilegious, invidious Greeks, look at the terrible offense that you have committed against the gods of Persia. And this is a sacrilege which cries out and demands for vindication. It demands for righteous satisfaction, because now the Greeks have played right into the hands of the Persians, because what the Greeks have done is they've given the Persians the right. They've given them the right. They've given them the mandate. They've given them essentially a sacred cause, a righteous cause. Because before, if the Persians just said, we're going to attack Greece, the Greeks could turn around and say, well, we Greeks haven't done anything to you. We haven't done anything to you recently. And in fact, the last confrontation between Greece and what was at that time, the Proto-Persians, was when the Proto-Persians committed an offense against the Greeks. When the people of Troy absconded with Helen of Sparta. Well, now the situation has changed. The dynamic has changed, okay? Inexorably and incontrovertibly so. To the point that now I don't think anybody can reasonably argue at this particular point in time that justice is on the side of the Greeks. And I guess what you could say is, well, the Greeks, they didn't intend to burn down the temple in the city of Sardis. They didn't intend to do that. But I say that's immaterial. I said it's a moot point. If you engage in some manner of criminal, degenerate destruction, right, and as a logical consequence of you engaging in that criminal act, and by criminal act I mean unilaterally and without provocation invading a city-state of a foreign country which hadn't committed any offense against you, you just go out there and you invade their city, right? And in the course of that act, which in and of itself is ipso facto wrong, in the course of that act, something happens which exacerbates the wrongdoing, even amplifies and magnifies the egregiousness of the wrong you inflicted upon these people. Well, I would submit that that was a natural and logical consequence of you starting fires in that city, right? If the Greek hoplite, the 4,000 Athenians and Eritrean allies of theirs go in there and they start lighting stuff on fire, is it a logical consequence? Is it foreseeable that if you start lighting the buildings in the city of Sardis on fire, is it a foreseeable consequence? Is it conceivable that, well, maybe the fire might spread, and there is this temple there to the gods? Well, maybe we should take some care and caution to ensure that we don't inadvertently cause the fire to spread to that temple and burn down the temple, because that would cause the Persians to come back and say that now they have a legitimate right to go and conquer the rest of Greece. If the Greeks were truly concerned about this, if the Greeks had actually given this the proper weight and consideration that it was due, I think they would have comported themselves in a much more scrupulous and circumspect and careful and cautious manner when they were, as opposed to just going in there and ransacking and pillaging the city of Sardis, and come what may, whatever happens, we don't care. So they lost the battle, right? They invaded for unjustifiable reasons, okay? They invaded to aid and abet a tyrant who didn't really have any legitimate right to rule his people. He was certainly ruling them in a way that was completely antithetical to the democratic sensibilities of the Athenians, right? So that didn't make any sense, right? So that doesn't suggest they have justice on their side. Number two, they didn't invade in a way that was properly organized and properly orchestrated or effectuated in a way so as to ensure that their invasion was successful. So that's a matter of miscalculating, not planning properly. And as far as I can tell, it seems to me that if you don't plan properly, then whatever happens to you, you deserve whatever happens to you, right? We are the authors of our own destiny, okay? As Cicero says, right? And if the Greeks, if the Athenians and their fellow idiotic allies hadn't properly anticipated and planned for this invasion in a way which ensured that it was conducted appropriately and properly based on the objectives that they had, well, then you know what? They deserved anything that flowed as a consequence of that lack of planning and proper operational planning and making sure that you have the necessary resources to accomplish the objectives that you set for yourself. And then thirdly, they committed the sacrilege against the gods, which I think is an unpardonable offense. There's nothing that the Greeks can say at this point that can excuse or can exculpate or even mitigate their responsibility for committing this terrible offense against the gods. And remember, an offense against one set of gods is an offense against all the gods, right? And so those whose gods have been offended have justice on their side. And I don't think that there's anything that the Greek can say at this point that can overcome that presumption of culpability with respects to just how terrible the offense was that they committed. All right, so I see that I got an hour and 53 minutes now on the clock, and I said I was going to go much over an hour and a half, and I apologize for that. So how about this? The next lecture, I'm going to give you guys a break. I'm only going to talk for about an hour. I'll give myself a break too. I will actually, I won't be seeing you guys next week because this video is meant to be watched in association with next week. But I will be seeing you in 10 days from now. All right. I hope you're looking forward to our reunion. I'm mostly looking forward to that reunion, assuming none of you guys have COVID. Or at least if you're aware of the fact you have COVID, you won't be in class. But as always, be safe, be well, watch out for COVID, and stay tuned. I'll talk to you guys in a couple of days. Thanks for watching.